Maybe it's time for another episode of your favorite show or podcast or video podcast that's called Finding Your Identity. It is time to get settled in, sit by the fire, get your hot cocoa, and listen up because we're going to get started. Welcome back to Finding Your Identity. I'm Derek McKinney, and this is episode 26, and I want to welcome you back. There was a little bit of a delay in making this 26th episode, and I apologize, but, you know, life gets in the way sometimes, and I'm doing this just, on my solo, so no. But I got a good episode for you, so get ready and put on your eye patches. Don't put them on both eyes. Well, I mean, I guess if you're listening to the podcast, you could put, a sleep mask on to make for a better listening experience, or you can have two pirate eye patches. I don't really care. Whatever you do to feel comfortable. It's cool, man. But if you're watching the video, it's going to be a little hard if you've got eye patches on, if you're watching YouTube. So, do what you think is right, and hopefully you make the right decision. But this episode, because I said eye patches and I was talking about pirate eye patches, is probably about how footballs are made, right? No, that wouldn't be right. Maybe it's about the letter R. Or no, this episode's brought to you by the letter R. Or maybe this episode is just about pirates. So there's actually an interesting history about pirates that I think is little known and their influence on democracy. So I think it's going to be a good episode. So stay tuned. If you really want to talk about finding identity, I think you can look at pirates as finding pretty, distinct identities in terms of them really making, this kind of shift over to a type of culture and to potentially be known as villains in a sense, because, I think it was well known that pirates were of a certain type of character, right? So that's kind of a decision you can't really make lightly, but, what's kind of interesting is you actually had a lot of sailors in the 16th century that were kind of forced out of the Navy because they were just being overworked and they were kind of abused, and they didn't really get a lot of respect, and it's kind of harsh. And I have to imagine, at a time when, it was kind of dangerous to be on the ocean, things could happen. Obviously there's a lot of ships sunk in the ocean. That's why there's like a thriving business of people who basically dive to ships that are under the water, and as salvage experts or treasure hunters. And that's kind of a fascinating career choice too, I would think, because you're spending a lot of time just hunting for something that you may never find, or you might find the big find, find some gold doubloons in the bottom of the ocean, and that's kind of exciting. But these sailors essentially made a decision to join pirate ships because the conditions were a lot more favorable on pirate ships than people would imagine. They're kind of fantasized like as kind of cutthroat, and the captain kind of rules all, and it gets obviously done in Hollywood, and you got the pirates movies, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies that really kind of give you this fantastical picture of what pirates were like and what the life of pirates was like, and a lot of that is just kind of, it's been Hollywoodized, right? It's been done in an effort to make the movies sell because everyone kind of likes that fantasy idea about pirates and the life they lived, and a lot of times I think people think that means that they were completely free and that the pirate's life was just like something to be envied, but it actually there was order to the chaos. The pirate ships and pirates had a big influence on democracy because they themselves they followed a democracy. They actually elected the captains of the ships, and they had three branches. They had this quartermaster that was the judge essentially, and then they had the ship council, the pirate council, which was essentially like a Congress, right? And the captain was the president, and they ruled with checks and balances, so it wasn't just the captain of the ship that would actually go out and say, it's my way or the highway kind of thing. Like, I think somebody might have said that in recent times, but in all truth, like most of the pirate ships operated this way, and it was like a little government on the ocean, and you kind of had to do that. You can't essentially operate with slaves, right? Like, because eventually the slaves might figure out that they could just take out the one guy while he's like sleeping or he's drunk or something, and then it's over, and then what? Like, one of them decides to try to be captain again, and then they're in the same thing. Like, you kind of need some kind of order. I mean, it's why democracy kind of thrives. I mean, in whatever watered down form it might be in, democracy thrives because there's the sense of the people having influence on the government. And I say watered down version because the United States is a democracy, but I think it's considered a republic more so. But with all the different tiers and stages and the way you kind of have to rise to power, it doesn't feel like the individual has a lot of power, but they do in a sense. I mean, the voting aspect, and this is kind of fitting because election day just passed. It wasn't a big election by any stretch because, like at least in Connecticut, it wasn't like we were choosing a governor. There's a lot of municipalities and local officials that were being elected. And, unfortunately, it's not as popular to go run to the voting booths in those smaller election years, right? But it's still important to vote, and if you want to have a say in potentially who's going to be on your town councils, and that can have an impact on you financially because it could that could control what your mill rate would be, your taxable rate on your property, right? So it is important to kind of be involved in those, but the biggest and most important election that you can be involved in is the presidential election, right? Like, and a lot of people just figure, well, what's the point? Because the electoral college, it's kind of slanted in a way that my vote doesn't really have an impact, but it does. I mean, it still all does trickle up. I mean, it is kind of crazy to see the numbers being, a little bit more on the popular vote versus the electoral college vote because of the way that it's set up. But, it still gives you a pretty good picture. I mean, in the United States, in the past couple elections, it really feels like, it's divided almost evenly. You even because you don't really get to the electoral win without getting a certain number of popular votes at a state level, and some people will argue that it's uneven in terms of the number of votes that the different states get in terms of electoral votes. But anyways, not trying to get into that kind of conversation, but the main point is that it is important for you to vote, and the pirates, they, the council and the, 100 or so, depending on the size of the ship, 100 or so crewmates that helped pick a captain were making an important decision to pick a captain that they trusted to not, you know, run them aground or get them sunk or get them into unnecessary fights where they would all die, you know, or make good decisions so that they don't, you know, get taken over by a rival pirate or something like that, you know. So I think to some degree, there's a lot of respect to be had for pirates because they, as much as they've been fantasized as being kind of ruthless and having, you know, no rules and following no rules, they really did, you know. That's kind of the main takeaway from this. And I think it's kind of a neat, like, tidbit, especially since, you know, they did kind of plunder, or they did, you know, take booty, BOTTY, as they call it, which is just, you know, a word that makes people giggle. But they did take money, or however they scored any kind of income for the ship, they distributed evenly, you know, amongst all the people based off of, you know, the skill and the duty. So essentially they got paychecks, you know, or paid based off of, you know, what they contributed back to the ship. So, you know, if you're a big contributor to the success of the ship, you'd get more of that booty, more of the money. And, you know, the fact that they did that kept crewmates happy, you know, and part of what kind of makes a successful government is keeping the people happy, and especially because they helped elect you, right? So it's like the government, you know, the captain and the quartermaster and the council, right? Like they all knew that they needed to kind of maintain order and keep the people happy. Otherwise, you know, that's the type of environment where it was a lot easier to have a coup where, you know, they would essentially, what do they call it? Mutiny, I mean, which is like a coup on the waters, I guess. But you know, it'd be easy to have a mutiny where they'd essentially, you know, get rid of the captain and then assign a new captain, and essentially the crew would take over the ship while that process was happening, and then it'd be like they just kind of redistribute the government again, you know. And that being said, you know, you kind of had to be a leader, like as a captain, with the knowledge that you're really trying to keep your crew happy, you know, so that they may remain productive, you know. And I think another thing that was kind of interesting is that they actually had a healthcare system, you know. The the dangers of being a pirate were pretty great, right? So they actually got compensation if they got injured in like a battle. So, you know, that was kind of interesting. So it's almost like, you know, the booty kind of also went into like a kitty, right? Like or some kind of savings account, like on you know, maybe it's like a smaller chest off to the side of the larger pirate chest. But, you know, they'd get money for things, you know. It was kind of an interesting concept, you know, like for the 1600s, you know, and most likely the influence kind of stemmed from way back when the Roman Empire, right? Like the concept of democracy wasn't new, but the fact that they employed it and they employed it successfully is kind of impressive, you know. So I think that's just kind of some interesting facts about you know, the pirates, and the fact that they had essentially this judge, you know, which is like the Supreme Court, or the, you know, the branch of the government that has the Supreme Court, right? So that person who kind of was like an assistant to the captain in a sense, you know, but it wasn't, because he was there by his side really to kind of keep him in check, right? Or to be a decider if for whatever reason, you know, so, you know, the captain wanted to do something, and, you know, that person had to kind of check, because they did have a pirate code, which is essentially like their constitution, you know. And you know, some of these ships had these constitutions that they essentially maintained, that they wrote up as rules for how that ship was going to operate. And the rules essentially, I said constitution, but I think they called it a charter. Whatever they called it, the rules were clearly defined by the whole crew. Like I guess a small ship would have been maybe like 100 sailors. Like a large ship could have like 250, 300. You have to imagine, all of these sailors like having influence is kind of a pretty big deal, right? And most of them acting as the council, they felt like they had some degree of power, but they, it's like everybody on the ship had a say on important matters that would affect, matters that would essentially affect the ship, because they had to make decisions as to, when they were going to attack other ships, and if they had to go to war with rival pirates, that was a big deal. And it wasn't just taken lightly. It wasn't the captain on a whim saying we're going to take that ship that we see in the distance. It was the crew who had, the ability to make a decision, and that, I think, that being like the Congress, it was kind of like, they like, obviously like today, the Congress is the legislative branch that makes the laws, and that's essentially what it was. They kind of set the laws. They also made it a distinct decision as to when they would elect new captains, and it wasn't necessarily like term limits like we have with the 2-term limits, 8 years for a president, but it was more like when they felt, the captain had served too long, or maybe was feel it like getting like too much power or something like that, then, they would make a decision to actually replace them and have another vote that would actually go about choosing a new captain. That's kind of, I think it's a cool concept, and then the quartermaster, again, who stood by the side of the captain, he also was in charge of settling disputes. He was the judge and jury in a sense. So if there was a dispute between crewmates, he would have to get in between and be an arbitrator. Also, if anybody did something wrong, that broke any of the laws that were kind of written up in that charter, he had to basically dole out the punishments. He had to decide what the punishment would be. And, I don't know, walking the plank seems like the most popularized punishment, but that's like a death sentence. And you're not going to have a successful ship if you start killing off crew, right? So that would have to be, an extreme penalty for an extreme crime, So I think most of the time it could just be that you got some crap jobs, like literally, having to deal with the crap or something in the sub basement of the ship, or whatever the heck you call it. Hull. I don't actually know the terms. Hull, I know hull is a term, and port side is a term. I think I should learn the ship terms. But anyways, in the lower levels, the disgusting rat infested section of the pirate ship, I remember when I was in, I think, high school, or maybe it was middle school, going on a field trip to Mystic Seaport, which is in Connecticut. And Mystic has some old pirate ships, maybe just one, I forget. But that was cool because we got to actually go on a tour. We get to go inside the ships. I think we actually got to go inside of a submarine too, and some pretty cool things down there at Mystic Seaport. And so that was always just, that was amazing. Like those pirate ships are just, very like beautiful, ornate things. That this actually might not have been a pirate ship. This might have been a privateer ship, or it could have been a Navy ship. I don't know. I don't know if it was a pirate ship. I can't really remember, but it was a big wooden ship because they got several of them down there. So who knows? Maybe it is. I have to look back, but it was cool anyways, going on an old wooden sailing ship, with those big masts and the big sails. See, I know another word, mast. but they're cool. Like the pirate ships were pretty cool. And there was, I forget what the name of the ship was, but it was unfortunate. I think it might have been during one of the hurricanes or some storm recently, but the ship that was used in the Pirates of the Caribbean was actually like a real ship, and apparently it sunk when they were trying to move it. Like in the past couple of years, they were trying to move it up somewhere for storage or display, and unfortunately it got sunk because of, I think it got stuck in a hurricane. I forget what happened. Can't even remember the name of the ship, but that seems kind of sad. But I don't know. Maybe that's where you bury ships. That maybe that's a fitting end to the ship's legacy. It's like being buried at sea. I think that's what the military actually does too. Like I think I've heard that they sink ships when they're done with them. They would just blow them up and then sink them and then use them for like diving exercises or something like that. I think I've heard of that a couple times actually, where they'd sink ships. Whether it be for military or for commercial, for private citizens to actually go out and dive to shipwrecks, they'd sink them so that they'd basically create an ecosystem around them. But anyways, I'm getting off track. Yes. And I forgot where I was, so I'm going to take a second. Okay, I found my place. I know what I was going to say next. What's actually interesting about the pirates of, the 16th century and then the 17th century and beyond was that, they actually played an important role in helping America, before it became officially America, before the Revolution, but helping the colonies actually survive, because there, England kind of didn't care too much about them, about the colonies, the American colonies early on, right? During that time, they were kind of just, okay, we're going to take what we can from them, right? But there was little care about getting stuff back to them, right? Supplies and stuff like that. And the pirates were on the ocean, and they were traveling all over the place. They were going into the Indian Ocean. They were down in India, Mediterranean. I'm just trying to think of oceans. I can just name them off. But they basically were out there, and they were doing their training gig. They were picking up supplies somewhere, maybe stealing it, maybe getting it legit or whatever, but then they were trading it for like gold or for other hot commodities like coffee beans or wherever it was. And they essentially brought that back to the colonies, because the colonies were lacking support. England cut them off, or just didn't, not cut them off, but just didn't have a steady supply sending over there. You got to imagine at the time that England was pretty spread out, because it was just, a situation where they were all over the place, right? At one point they said the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that was because the British had claims around the entire world, and the sun never set on it, because the sun obviously is always shining. The world is not flat. And the sun, would be shining on Australia where they had claims, or, in India or Africa, and that being said, that little island had quite an impact, if you really think about it. Britain, kind of thrived as being such a tiny island. But that being said, it was like the colonists were essentially kind of forgotten or pushed to the side, because I guess that just, a lot of people who were basically escaped England, right? So England was a little bit bitter about that, and it wasn't until it became a thriving society that England started to pay attention to them and recognize that there was actually resources that were being exploited that they didn't want to miss out on. And then, then it was a matter of collecting taxes from the people that lived there. And England was like, all right, now you've proven this is a decent place, or we want to get ours, right? So the pirates actually had a big influence because they essentially were operating this black market for the colonists to purchase necessities, like it wasn't just, frivolous things like, currency was important, right? So they were able to make trades or bargain or whatever, barter, in order to actually get currency that they could then use to then go back and then purchase stuff back from wherever, England or other countries. But the pirates kind of played an important role because they helped them. Basically, they helped them when they were struggling, and they were that channel to help them obtain things, right? Because the pirates are constantly going out and going to other countries and then coming back because they had the ships, and like the colonies, maybe were catching rides like back to England, or I don't think anyone actually went back to England, but people were catching rides to the Americas and then kind of getting dropped off, and then that was that. And then it was like, okay, fend for yourself. You have to imagine it was hard times. I mean, the whole story of Thanksgiving was because the colonists were really not prepared, and the Indians had to help them, learn how to survive in this area. So it was tough times. I wouldn't want to live in that time period. That's one of those like time periods I'm not thinking, oh wow, that would be really cool to live during that time period. No thanks. Really seems cold. I just imagine it's always cold. And as much as I like the cold, I like living in New England because you get the flavor of all the seasons where, okay, we deal with cold for a couple months, but then February gets here and it's still cold, and I'm like, all right, I'm ready for spring. But, thankfully it's only like 2 months away. So then I can deal with it, but if it was just like cold all the time, I'd be just disgruntled. So the pirates helped out, and that was an important factor, and they definitely brought a lot to them, and there was actually an act. It was called the Navigation Act, and there's more than one, I guess. The Navigation Acts, which they essentially restricted the, I guess, international commerce, as you could call it, or trafficking of goods, and they they essentially got stuck, like because of that, that just limited the ability to import and even export, which was kind of silly, but that was just, England was just silly. So at the time, that was just kind of like, it didn't seem like it was benefiting anybody, except it was just, the king or queen or whatever at the time was really just kind of, I guess, operating like how they had always operated. So, and they were making a ton of money off of it, right? The East India Trading Company, I think it was called, is what, the big cash cow, as you could say, for England. And, if it's not broke, right? So England kind of just operated how they continued to operate. But anyway, so they were helped out essentially, right? But things didn't quite always stay that way, or things didn't stay that way for long. There was a certain period of time where that was a beneficial relationship between the colonists and the pirates, but then the pirates got greedy. So it wasn't exactly that I say they turned greedy, but they were always greedy. And pirates were essentially doing this job. They were like these little mini countries, right, or little mini governments that were floating in the ocean. And they were kind of given this authority in a sense by different governments, right? Because there was essentially this need to there wasn't exactly navies that like you'd imagine them today, where they were very organized, or that they had a ton of ships, right? That were able to move. I mean, I think a lot of times the navies were more or less more like coast guards, where they were kind of there to help protect the nations like close to home, but not necessarily like running out on the seas and going all over all the oceans, like you imagine the Navy today, where the U.S. Navy is like all over the world, right? But it was more like that. They were kind of helping protect the individual countries, right, closer to home. And the the nations, like when they started to go to war with each other, they'd actually kind of dub the captains as privateers, right? The captains of some of these ships, and then that kind of spurred this this private industry almost. Like it's like they basically it created capitalistic. I guess I imagine it like how capitalism, and when they say you privatize like healthcare or whatever, like when you basically take it away from the government's hands and let private citizens kind of form companies or whatever, it essentially is a way to kind of grow things faster or let things kind of take off. And like what they're doing with the space race, right? Like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, with their space companies to create rockets, and there's a monetary incentive now, so it's happening quicker. The research and development is happening faster, and it's no longer a bureaucracy dealing with it and getting something up and running. And now the U.S. is actually like hitching rides to the space station, or tying payloads to these private rockets that the Bezos and Musks are creating. And this is essentially making the process a little bit more distributed, right? So that's kind of what happened to kind of start piracy, or to create pirates, right? Because it was like they privatized the oceans in a sense by saying, okay, if you got a ship and you're a captain, we're going to dub you a privateer. We're going to give you an official letter from the king or queen, right? And we're going to say that you're legit and that you're going to represent us, and you can go attack enemy ships, and while you're there, take whatever you want, take their goods and bring it back home, and just give us a cut of it, and we'll be fine, right? And what happens is that's you basically just created pirates, right? Like, because all the countries are doing it, like England and France, and the Dutch, right? Like, so these are all different countries that essentially were kind of like, oh, we got to do this now. Like we need privateers, right? And then it becomes like this, I guess, a lust for the life, and a lust for the gains of it, right? And a lot of pirates were broke, right? And you have to wonder, like, why did they become pirates? Well, it was kind of a gamble. It's kind of like the treasure hunters of today that are trying to salvage shipwrecks. There's a lot of irony in this, right? First they got to go and try and find a shipwreck, right? And some of them are digging up history behind it, right? Oh, okay, so what might be on this ship? And then they got to put all this money into essentially resurfacing the ship, or getting equipment so they can dive down in the ocean to the shipwreck, for the off chance that they're going to find something of true value, and make a ton of money. There may be a lot of these treasure hunters or whatever, underwater excavators that make no money. And so pirates, essentially, that was the appeal. So they were kind of gamblers, and they were kind of gambling and going out on the ocean to potentially score big, but you get oversaturated, and this was a 100-year period, roughly, maybe less. Imagine it was between late 1600s and mid 1700s that was like what they call the golden age, right? The glory years of the pirates of the Caribbean, and it really was just during those, let's say, 50 years that they just kind of had this free reign to run. And, I think it took a lot of the governments just finally realizing the dangers of it, and then putting an end to the programs, no longer giving out those letters. And then it became like, okay, well, now we got to stop them. We got to capture these pirates, and we got to actually, we gave them money, and we gave them ships, and we gave them power. And now we got to round them all up and kind of put an end to this. And some of the big, well, two of the big names, Blackbeard and Black Bart, were essentially captured and then killed. And that kind of set a ripple effect across the pirates, right? Because that was kind of recognized as sending a pretty big message, right? Because those were two of the most famous at the time, notorious, and that essentially kind of squashed that whole idea of pirates. I mean, not to say that it stopped, but I think it stopped every small person, that was, that had a boat from calling themselves a pirate and running around in the ocean. I think it did a lot to kind of quash that, right? So that was kind of that period of time, which was, that 50 years. But there's still pirates today. I mean, there's Somalian pirates that take over ships. And there's a movie with Tom Hanks, and I forget what it's called, but it's Captain blah, whatever his name is. Captain something. And, that was essentially a modern day pirate story. There's actually, I think it might have been a podcast. I forget what I was listening to, but there was something that was, there was talking about the modern day pirates are essentially, they're very enterprising, and it becomes, it becomes something. Oh, maybe it was, no, it wasn't cereal. I forget what it was, but there was, but it was, it was someone was doing some digging. I think it was a podcast, but they were interviewing a guy who was kind of a negotiator, right? And he was like the president or leader of some small country. I don't know. I'm drawing a blank as I talk about it now, but that was the thing. It was like Somalian pirates. They actually kidnapped this couple, and they were holding them hostage. And then, there was essentially a ransom, and there's all these things to try to get the ransom there, and all these things. And the money, kept changing, essentially, the amount that the ransom was. And it's just a mess, but that's how they're operating these days. They're using Bitcoin, right? That's the kind of how modern it's become to be pirates, right? But they're doing things for bigger stakes, right? So it's kind of it's an interesting history in our world, and the way to play it, to me, I mean, it's kind of dangerous, but it's not as dangerous. But being a salvager, some kind of or treasure hunter, that's kind of a interesting career choice right there. But that's got to be kind of exciting. I mean, it is a treasure hunter, but you're essentially looking for pirates, booty in the water. But yeah, so that's the little bit I wanted to talk about with the pirates and whatnot. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Finding Your Identity. And until next time, I will bid you adieu. No. No. It's actually funny. Like, I don't know. From what I was looking up, like, nobody can really prove that there's actually the word R was actually ever uttered by any pirate. But, it's just fun. It's kind of goes with the Halloween costume. It's your catchphrase. Anyways, this is Finding Our Identity, and until next time, have a good one.